All right, let us begin. Now, just for the people following online, can you hear me? So if you can hear me, you can just type something in the chat, please. So we are recording this. I hope everyone's fine with this. So can you hear us? Hello? Yes, someone is typing. Okay, they can hear us. Everything's fine. So we'll just do a brief introduction now. And then when Martti takes the floor, we shall share the screen so you can follow the PowerPoint online. And when he's finished, we will again stop sharing this screen with you so you can just see what you're seeing now, namely us standing here at this desk. So without further ado, just this. I will begin. Dear members of the audience and dear members of our symposium, it has fallen on me to say the first couple of words introducing our present event. The public lecture that Professor Martti Koskenniemi is about to deliver is part of a larger scientific symposium that will take place this afternoon elsewhere on campus. It's entitled Imagining Peace in the Long 19th Century, from the French Revolution, the first one, until 1914. The subtitle is In Search of New Actors and Vocabularies. And like most gatherings of scholars, the title is, of course, perhaps a bit of a mouthful. So what do we mean by imagining peace by new actors and vocabularies? You know, as many of you, of course, know, the long 19th century was, of course, a very interesting century filled with intense and rapid changes. Powerful political, legal, economic, and cultural developments enabled new ways to imagine peace and to think about law. Like most centuries, probably, as any historian will probably say, it was a century of apparent contradictions. It was a century in which industrial and commercial growth, buoyed by capitalism, caused both massive poverty and also, for some at least, unprecedented wealth. It was a time of law and order, but also of frequent insurrections. Revolutions introduced written constitutions into the political system of many states, guaranteeing a host of political and civil rights to many citizens. At the same time, however, many citizens were also denied these same rights. Many were left behind, of course, in the 19th century. And specifically to peace, as I've alluded to, it was considered both by observers at the time and also by historians today. In the popular imagination, the 19th century was the longest unbroken stretch of peace in European history. At the same time, of course, while there may have been relative peace in parts of Europe during the 19th century, imperial expansion by European powers caused endless wars abroad. Anyone who opened up a random newspaper in the 19th century would have probably had a great chance of coming across some report of some distant armed conflicts in the colonies and elsewhere in the world. Lauren Benton, an American legal historian, has called this a state of perpetual war and endless violence in the 19th century. But even at home in Europe, where there was supposedly a period of unprecedented peace, this was not taken for granted by contemporaries. Historians like Miroslav Širivý, present here, of course, have emphasized widespread feelings of insecurity in most of European society at this time in the 19th century. There may not have been open war in the first half of the century, but there were feelings of anxiety about rivalries and flagrant violations of international law. There was also an escalating arms race at various intervals. And of course, by the 1850s, this period of relative peace, of course, came to an end, one might say. The Crimean War signified the first great power war since Napoleon in Europe. And many other wars followed in the second half. You had wars in Denmark, in Italy, in Austria, in France, in Germany. Well, Germany invading other countries, actually, and other European countries, until, of course, the Great War that ended in the popular imagination, the long 19th century, the War of 1914. So peace, in other words, was very much on the agenda for people living between 1789 and 1914. But how did one argue for peace? What did peace even mean? Surely it was something better than just a temporary absence of warfare. For most, peace was something more. It was a long-term condition which was also desirable because it was connected to some notion of justice. A peace also had to be just. And when you speak of justice, of course, you begin to touch upon the realm of lawyers and international law and constitutional law and every other kind of norm. So changes in the 19th century in communications technology and the press, in suffrage laws, etc., allowed civil society to raise its voice stronger than ever in the 19th century. It has become almost a truism to say that the 19th century was, of course, the first age of public opinion, with all due nuances, of course. And this is, of course, the topic of our symposium. How did civil society imagine a rule-based world order in this century? How did they relate to the arguments forwarded by professional jurists, by official diplomats, and anyone else involved within official governmental circles at this time? The members of this symposium will try to answer these questions this afternoon. I've already mentioned one participant, Miroslav Širivi, but there are, of course, also others who will take part. Hendrik Simon will bring up Kantian debates on peace, because as you know, of course, the philosopher from Königsberg wrote one of the most famous peace plans of all time called Zum ewigen Frieden. If we're staying in Germany, then of course our other participant, Jakob Sollmann, will tell us the very interesting story of Edward Löwenthal, one of Germany's first public pacifists. My own paper, incidentally, will of course also be devoted to the peace movement in a more broad sense. I will sketch the legalistic aspects of the early and mid-century peace movement in my talk. Moving on, we have Thomas Hippler, who will talk about how the influential forces of nationalism had an influence on 19th century political thought, because the 19th century was not only an age of internationalism for some, but it was also, of course, the great age of nationalism. And this, of course, can be contrasted to Eliana Augusti's presentation, which will investigate universalistic discourses within 18th and 19th century international law texts. I've already mentioned Miroslav Širivi's thesis about insecurity. Specifically, he will talk about German and Italian citizens who were disturbed by the assertive and illegal policies of the great powers. Disturbed by how might apparently seem to make rights, they sought for ways to introduce a new law of nations. And then finally, of course, we have Milos Već, who is also talking about the instruments of the great powers, of course. How did they assert their might in the 19th century? Well, of course, one of the favorite tools of 19th century states was, of course, the act of conducting small-scale armed reprisals, something they call the famous measures short of war. How did interested lawyers of the time look at this? Were they aware of the dark sides of this instrument, which was often couched in the language of humanitarianism? And how did they look at it in light of broader attempts at normative peace building in this century? But finally, of course, we have the person that you're all here for today, of course, Martti Koskenniemi. And his lecture will be public. So thank you. I'll give the floor to Raphael.
Yeah, many thanks, Wouter, for the very elaborate introduction, and also congratulations again on yesterday's excellent thesis, Public Defense, because Wouter just defended his thesis yesterday. And so again, congratulations. First of all, also as co-organizer of the symposium, I would want to thank all the participants for accepting our invitation and for coming here in the VUB in Brussels. My thanks goes also to the audience, and I think you will not regret to have come here on a Friday morning, although the academic year has not started yet. And so I'm not going to speak any further on the symposium, but I will now introduce briefly our speaker. It's a great honor to introduce Martti Koskenniemi. We had the pleasure of having him here on the 1st June 2023. We had a very nice ceremony where he among others, also was awarded an honorary doctorate. So Martti Koskenniemi began his career actually as a diplomat and a legal advisor of the Republic of Finland. This led to various posts in different parts of the world. He was, for example, vice consul in Marseille in 1980. It's a city I know pretty well because I spent all my childhood in Marseille. And he was then also legal advisor to the Finnish mission to the United Nations in New York, so between 1989 and 1991. And above all, director of the International Law Department at the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 1991 to 1994, that is to say the main legal advisor of the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So during his years in the upper echelon of diplomacy and international law, he defended a doctoral thesis in international law and published it under the title From Apology to Utopia, the Structure of International Legal Argument. This first book received immense acclaim, and it is still a must for any scholar dealing with legal argumentation today. In 1994, he embarked on an academic career, first as a professor of international law at the University of Helsinki, and then as director of the Erik Castrén Institute of International Law and Human Rights at the same university. For almost 30 years now, he has completely renewed the study of international law and its history, and inspired several generations of researchers. In a way, we can say that we are a bit all his pupils in this field. Among his complex publications, I did only mention The Gentle Civilizers of Nations, The Rise and Fall of International Law, 1870-1960, published in 2001, and the most recent, To the Uttermost Part of the Earth, Legal Imagination and International Power, 1800-1870, published 2 years ago, which has given rise to numerous reviews and historiographical debates. I recommend you to read the 19 pages review by David Armitage on the book, and you should read that review while listening to the Mariage of Figaro from Mozart. Martti Koskenniemi is also a member of the Institut de Droit International since 2003 and of various learned societies. He has been also a visiting professor at a large number of universities throughout the world. As you can imagine, even though he's now Professor Emeritus at the University of Helsinki, his agenda remains very full, so we are all the more delightful to benefit from his erudition and eloquence as a keynote speaker. So, dear Martti, thanks again for being here with us, and you have now the floor for, I think, around 45 minutes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Raphael, for that lovely introduction. It's great to be here. We had, as Raphael said, I was granted the great honor of honorary doctorate here at the VUB. At the time in the spring, there was no occasion for me to speak, so we agreed that I would speak in this context. And of course, I want to congratulate Wouter for his wonderful PhD defense yesterday. I thank him for having me read that and learn so much about the 19th century peace movements that I didn't know. I had a couple of comments on that excellent work, and I think we are going to continue the conversation as to how peace and law relate to each other. From my own perspective, law is equally close to peace and war, justifying both when need be. And so maybe that offers also a background for what I'm going to say a little bit today. Anyway, as they say, in order to excuse themselves, this is work in progress. So no finished anything, it's just some ideas, some of which I've inserted in the epilogue of the next to my last book, The Uttermost Parts of the Earth, because the last book came out just 3 weeks ago, together with David Kennedy, a very different kind of a book. But so in the epilogue of the Uttermost Parts, I make some suggestions about the 19th century, which were fragmentary there, which still remain fragmentary, but which I think provide, at least for me, a research agenda. And this is about the law of civil society. So, as you know, in The Gentle Civilizer, I made the point that international law in the modern, professional, Eurocentric way that we know it began in 1873, or as I like to say to entertain students, it began on the 8th of September 1873 after lunch. And not going to argue that any longer. I'm just making the point that in this work, I suggested that the profession of modern international law was based on an intellectual world that thought civilization as a key concept through which to access the world in the legal terms, the world in general. And that notion, civilization, was a very hierarchical notion. It was the object of endless debate among the members of the Institute and the members of the new profession of international law. What does civilization mean? What sort of categories within civilization, or what sort of degrees of civilization are there? There never was any clear-cut analysis of that or any consensus about that, although many lawyers dwelt on the theme of civilization a lot. The project, the concrete project that the men of 1873, that is to say, modern international lawyers, took upon themselves, was divided in 2 parts. One was to introduce liberal legislation in Europe. They were all moderate liberals, old liberals, new liberals, conservative liberals, radical liberals, but liberals, and they were worried that the ascent of liberalism that was pursued in the latter part of the 19th century for some time was over by 1873, nationalism, socialism, etc., new threats. So they took upon themselves to try to use their professional skills in order to distribute information about liberal laws in different European countries. Private international law, comparative law had to do with that. And the other part of what they wanted to do was to civilize the colonies, and there the notion of civilization stood very clearly. So in this book, and in several talks and writings, I have been arguing that the notion of civilization is key to understanding what European international lawyers did. And now I'm going to make just some suggestions that there was an alternative vocabulary that might have taken over instead of civilization, but that didn't. Fragments of that vocabulary persisted in the 20th and 21st century, and I'm not going to examine how they then reappeared in the course of the 20th or 21st century. That has been often debated. Instead, I want to examine how that alternative vocabulary emerged in the 19th century among lawyers, and what happened for that alternative vocabulary when it was overruled by the vocabulary of civilization. Okay. So there was always an idea of humankind being related to each other at the level of individuals and families. I'm not going to say much about this. One can, in the Christian inheritance, for instance, there's a lot of talk about universalism from the great Summa Theologia of Aquinas onwards, the Spanish Dominicans, etc. One vocabulary, one universalist vocabulary that many people knew in the early 19th century was obviously the Kantian vocabulary of universal community and cosmopolitan right. This is from the Zum ewigen Frieden, the second and the third articles, but especially the third article, universal hospitality, where Kant speaks about the necessity of providing hospitality for foreigners as they enter the realm. They are not entitled to settle down permanently, but they are entitled to come in and to lead their lives for at least until they find another place in which to settle. I'm not going to go into that. I think we'll be hearing more about Kant's ideas on universal community. Now, I think Wouter already yesterday, or somebody mentioned that Kant, among the pacifists, Kant wasn't a big name. He cropped up every now and then, but the peace activists did not think of themselves as Kantians. And I come back in a moment on what they might have thought of themselves. Anyway, that was a vocabulary. And Kant's name is mentioned by Georg Friedrich von Martens in his Précis de droit international moderne de l'Europe. He mentions Kant once and the idea of perpetual peace, and he says, well, this is about philosophy and not about law. Now, in a number of writings, and again, I'm not going to go into any detail, I have noted how large the influence of Martens was especially in the early 19th century, in this in the uttermost parts of the earth, in the relevant section. I list a little bit what lawyers around 1840s, 1850s said about the state of the discipline. And they all said that Martens is almost the discipline. And they all said that because they were unsatisfied with that situation, because the discipline, as it was imagined by this person, had a very specific character, which many people, many lawyers in the 1840s, 1850s found insufficient, subject to criticism. Now, Georg Friedrich von Martens was last on the line of a long line of famous Göttingen public lawyers, most of whom had been teaching public law and natural law together, had a naturalist vision of public law. By the time Martens came to Göttingen, 1785, 88, natural law had already begun its decline. And he found himself having the chair of natural law, or a chair in which people were expected to teach natural law, but he didn't. That was not what he wanted to do. So instead, he produced his own textbook, a much thinner textbook than the earlier ones, and especially a very different textbook from that of Vattel, which proposed a wholly new understanding of what the law of nations was. For him, this modern European law of nations, or international law, was European diplomacy, reimagined, redescribed, or recharacterized as a legal system. That is to say, he suggested that when diplomats engaged in conferences where they or treaty making, what they were doing was that they administered and gradually created a legal system of modern European law of nations. So where Vattel and the earlier natural lawyers in Göttingen and Halle and other places began their textbooks by abstract reflection on the nature of humankind, or on the nature of human being, on how to derive universal norms, and suggested that the a priori of the law of nations lay in the field of philosophical thinking about the nature of human being. Martin suggested that the a priori was situated in a totally different place. So if you open Martin's, you don't get philosophical reflection. There is no talk about a naturalist tradition. Instead, the book starts with the enumeration of European states. How many states there are, what is the character of their statehood, and so on. And so that is the ground on which he bases European law of nations. These states have representatives, and Martens goes through classifications of various kinds of diplomats, various degrees of diplomatic status. Then those diplomats engage in, well, diplomacy, and diplomacy produces treaties. And treaties are the law of nations. So very concrete, very pragmatic, very down to earth. And in order to highlight that, Martens scandalously starts to teach in the afternoons, in seminars, in French, where he has his students produce diplomatic acta. So no longer an ex cathedra exposition. Well, he did that in the morning, but in the afternoon, he imagined his seminar class as a kind of a diplomatic school. And the heart of that school was to understand what treaties are, how treaty making, how diplomatic contexts take place. He did preface some of the later versions of his textbook with a foreword in which he utterly rejected the French revolutionary inheritance. And that was reproduced textbook after textbook in the 19th century. This was a work of restoration. So Martens was careful to try to suggest that this law of nations was not something that could underwrite or support the way to revolution. On the contrary, it was about order as diplomacy is. And the Recueil Martens, the treaty collection, is in some way a very palpable, concrete demonstration of what it was that he wanted to achieve, how he understood the law of nations. Okay. And he used the expression that the law of nations is the external public law, äußeres Staatsrecht of European countries. So it's their their diplomacy is conducted under their public law. It is a public law that works externally towards other countries. The word external public law was then taken on by Friedrich Hegel, and Hegel explained that, of course, with states, there are no higher authorities in the world. So when states interact, they interact through äußeres Staatsrecht, through external public law. I would be very interested to try to find out, that may be impossible, whether Hegel actually was thinking of Martens when he used that locution. If anybody in the class or here in the audience knows about this, I'd be happy to talk about that. Anyway, it struck me, so 1821, in the outlines of the philosophy of right, the external public law crops up. It had cropped up in the most popular and the most widely used law of nations treaties of Europe, that is to say, Martens. But of course, Hegel puts that notion in a wholly different frame. I can't go to details about the Hegelian view of law or society, apart from reminding ourselves that external public law exists in this characterization of human relationships, threefold characterization. So family, civil society, and state. Families, we all need families. Family is pure subjectivity. Then there is the notion of the civil society in which we move as abstract individuals. It is the realm of need. Economics, for instance, takes place in civil society, and all kinds of, because needs and interests are colliding, the contrast has to be mediated by some organ, and the state is the Aufhebung of all of this. I'm really interested in that second notion, the civil society, the realm of need. If one reads from the outline of philosophy of right, what Hegel says about that, it's clear that this is something that is part of modernity. Hegel was a sharp reader of Adam Smith, one of the best commentators of Adam Smith, and his characterization of the nature of commercial society, of industrialization, and of the proletarianization of the masses is really based on a careful reading of Smith, but also a careful viewing of things that were taking place in Europe at the time. And he also noted that the civil society, again, the realm of need, had this expansive dynamism with it. And foreign trade, imperialism, colonialism, although he didn't use those words, but that's there. All of that is created through the expansion of civil society. Now, and he, of course, thought that it is up to the state to mediate the very many contradictions between the classes, for instance, that emerge in modernity, the social classes, and of other conflicts between groups of civil society. Lorenz von Stein, was a young public lawyer from Kiel, who went in the 1840s to France to survey the developments, the revolutionary developments in France. Here are the two books that were produced by his visits there, Der Sozialismus und Kommunismus des heutigen Frankreichs and Geschichte der sozialen Bewegung in Frankreich from 1789 to 1850. In these two works, Lorenz von Stein tries to understand the nature of industrial and commercial modernity by reference to the ideas of the social that emerged from the revolution. That is to say, the inheritance of Saint-Simonianism, of Charles Fourier, but also of the revolutionary movement itself, social movement, soziale Bewegungen, a new vocabulary that he produced, through which he characterized a new realm of research for public law. One thing that he said early on in his 1842 book on the revolutionary inheritance was that the struggle of today in Europe, although it may seem to be about constitutional rule, is not really about constitutional rule. Instead, it's about social relations. Of course, we recognize ex post facto that something like the social question was emerging in different ways and under different vocabularies in different European locations. But von Stein's writings are an interesting and intelligent and complex effort to put the social question in the language of public law as von Stein had learned it in Kiel, and what he wanted to reform. Here are some of the ideas that he put forward. He focused on labor, that the relationships in modern civil society are created by labor. Different classes have different interests and organize themselves as soziale Bewegungen. The heart of society is conflict Gegensatz between those who own and those who don't. It's fantastic to read this stuff by somebody who actually is a conservative, or who is anything but a Marxist. On the contrary, what he suggests to his German readers is that there is something coming out from the revolutionary inheritance, and you had better understand it, because otherwise it will overwhelm you. And so his constructive proposal at the end is that because there are these conflicts in this new realm of society, and because those conflicts have to do with very fundamental contradictions between those who own and those who don't own, it is up to the state to try to occupy a neutral space in order to mediate those contradictions. Now the problem is, he suggests, that each of these soziale Bewegungen, each of these classes, he uses that term, each of these classes tries to capture the state and use the state. And he uses I thought, quite an intelligent metaphor. When they capture the state dies. So the death of state is the capture of the state by one of these classes or one of these interest groups. And in order to prevent the death of the state, one has to focus on the monarch. So it's quite secondary what kind the constitution is like, because in relationship to the social conflicts, the constitution is quite secondary. But what is not secondary is the effort to keep the neutrality of the state, and you can't keep it through constitutional means. Only the monarch, who embodies the state as a living body, can do this. And then, of course, conflict spreads internationally, and he uses this awkward to be expression, Größengesetz der Kapitalien. So not a Marxist, an anti-Marxist. Then in 1945-47, Stein writes 2 essays on Völkerrecht, in which he recognizes that what we have as Völkerrecht is Martens. And that's pretty dumb and useless and old-fashioned, because it has no concept of society in it. It's just these states and diplomats who operate. And he takes up a number of features of the 1840s that he thought were revolutionary, that just utterly presented a different image than the image of standard European diplomacy produced by Martens. So there's the Monroe Doctrine, there is the German Customs Union, there is the fantastic, as he felt, intensification of treaty making. Trade treaties, not treatises, but treaties, customs issues, private relations, and all of that. And he spoke of the Wolffian notion, civitas maxima, as today receiving a new life in the unity of state life. That is to say, the uniform fashion in which society organizes itself in industrial modernity, where ownership is the fundamental notion that creates class conflict, that then sets conditions for the policies of states. Now, much of this is really, everybody was writing about that, but nobody almost was writing it in the context of an effort to produce a new vision, a new vocabulary of public and international law. Well, there was another person, Robert von Moll. And actually von Moll, in his writings, in his prolific writings, often referenced Stein. Now, who was von Moll? Von Moll was a professor of public law and later public and administrative law at the University of Heidelberg. He became elected as one of the members of the Frankfurt Parliament in 1848, the revolutionary year of 1848. He was a liberal. What sort of liberal? Historians disagree on that a little bit. He's usually labeled an old liberal, and he was in favor of the Kleindeutsch solution to the German problem. But not only he was a member of the Frankfurt Parliament of the short-lived German Republic, he became the Minister of Justice of that short-lived German Republic. After the failure of the revolution, unlike many of his colleagues and friends, he was able to return to Heidelberg and continue teaching. His only substantive work on a specific item of the law of nations was a long article on asylum, obviously, because all of his friends were seeking asylum in Switzerland, England, and in other places. But I come back to that in a moment. But like von Stein, von Moll was interested in industrial modernity and felt very strongly that the kind of Polizeiwissenschaft that had been developed in German universities, again, especially Göttingen, Halle, that brought forward important, interesting aspects of how to govern modern society, but it didn't take sufficiently into account the autonomy of the actors in civil society, and that the writings of von Humboldt, for instance, which pointed to the emergence of market society outside the state, should also be integrated, that kind of thinking should be integrated into a new Polizeiwissenschaft, which would then become modern administrative law that would, above all, set down the conditions of access to market and the rules of how the market would work. Anyway, I've just quoted him from his programmatic article, Gesellschaftswissenschaften und Staatswissenschaften. So he suggested this, one can say without exaggeration, I understand from my readings of German public law, that von Moll was perhaps the most important public lawyer at this time, and the most widely respected. And certainly his encyclopedic writings, in a sense, organized the whole discipline anew in the middle of the century. So this is not just some marginal weirdo we are talking about. This is somebody who speaks with a voice of authority, who comes from the liberal corner, not from the early 19th century Rotek type of liberalism, but a liberalism that thinks of itself as ruling. And he notes, as I've quoted him here, from this essay in which he contrasts the sciences of society and the sciences of state to each other, that the word society has sounded, it's spoken with great concern. It has become a key word of struggles waged from speakers' podium. So he is very knowledgeable that there are these social Kreise, as he calls them, social associations, social circles. So people organize themselves in social groupings by reference to their shared interests. And as he then writes on his in his article on the support of international society as the task of Völkerrecht in 1860, he says, well, a new Völkerrecht should have the task really of supporting these developments in the international social field that take place independently of states. So there's a need for a new social method, and we need the Lehre von der internationalen Gemeinschaft. Well, one can say this is a doctrine of international community. Here, of course, by this time, Tönnies's famous distinction between community and society had not yet been published. This is 1887, only when Tönnies publishes that distinction. And so I find both von Stein and von Moll move between ideas of common life in the Tenney's sense and social life in the sense. But anyway, using both of these kinds of perspectives on society, there are a number of themes that von Moll takes up in this programmatic article for the renewal of the law of nations. It has to be based on an idea of international community, stroke society. All kinds of social associations should be included in it. He thinks in terms of social classes, but also companies and associations of civil activity of various kinds. And he, in a very modern sense, he describes an individual that is not just a citizen, but that is also a member of a religious denomination, that also operates in some field of economic activity, and so on and so on. So something that we, of course, have been very accustomed to relating to the modern individual who is split in these various ways. And he says that the standard liberal distinction, which exists throughout the liberal tradition, and when I say liberal tradition, I mean the philosophical tradition from Locke, Rousseau, and Kant, all that tradition is unable to see that space between the state and the individual. And so there was a vocabulary of civil society early on. Locke, for instance, talks about civil society. Rousseau talks about civil society. But for them, civil society is about the pact-making activity that then creates the state. And here now, von Moll wants to say, no, there is something else there. Anyway, so now we are in 1860. This is a person and a group of lawyers and others who are living the traumatic period of the failure of the 1848 revolution. And you can see, you can feel that von Moll tries to get something going from the revolutionary tradition. And although he dresses it in very professional, heavy German public law terms, there is still an awareness that society is moving, that that cannot be expressed and doesn't exist in the Martens tradition. Now, in 1882, von Stein, by this time, von Stein, who isn't at all as famous as von Moll, so he's had personal difficulties. He leaves aside the commentaries on the French Revolution, but then suddenly, 1882, already, so now he's professor of public law and finances in Vienna. He publishes einige Bemerkungen über das internationale Recht, some remarks on international law, in Schmolles Jahrbuch. So in the context of academic work that has the very project of thinking about society, that then leads into the Verein für Sozialwissenschaft and Max Weber, and all of that is down that road. Now, he's not on that road yet, but he says, well, there should be a new kind of an internationale Recht, and he contrasts Völkerrecht and internationale Recht. We are of the opinion, and this is my translation again, that the time of old Völkerrecht has passed, and the epoch of international Recht, of the lives of peoples will take over. Now, here he talks about the internationalization of governance, and this is a long article, and a lot of it repeats the kind of stuff that knowledgeable late 19th century men, mostly at universities, were writing about when they surveyed the globalization of everything. I mean, they didn't use that vocabulary of international. But what he said there was also that this globalization has now entered the states, so that when governments govern, they govern through principles and taking into account features of society that have nothing national about them, that they are international, and that therefore it's imperative that bureaucrats, when they are trained in law schools, are trained into this kind of internationalism, because they cannot do their job at home properly without being international. Okay, so no. So here is Heinrich von Treitschke, already in 1859, attacking both Lorenz von Stein and Robert von Mohr in his Habilitation, no less. This is Treitschke's Habilitation, Die Gesellschaftswissenschaft, ein kritischer Versuch, a science of society, a critique. And he takes up especially von Mohr, and point by point tries to show that this thing you call society is inexistent, that there is no realm, nor should there be any realm in which the state would not be the regulatory participant. The object of the science of state, Staatsrecht, the classical German Staatsrecht, is the whole external order into which the life of the people has been organized. Its classes, its circles. Everybody is dependent on state, so there's no reason. And what he kind of, just at the end of this Habilitation, he comes to the fact, and besides, here's the main point he makes actually, and besides, Germany is not united. If you think that we Germans can think of ourselves as a people merely by having this amorphous, awkward Gesellschaft, then you are betraying the great project of uniting us in a state. So to focus on society is to undermine the idea of the state. And Treitschke, of course, is in the very project of German statehood. There's another person agreeing with Treitschke, this time a liberal. So Johann Caspar Bluntschli. Bluntschli has to leave his native Switzerland in 1848 because of the revolutionary things there. He goes first to Munich, but then in Heidelberg. And for a short time, von Mohr and Bluntschli are colleagues in the Heidelberg law faculty. Now, fortunately, both of these very prolific men have written memories in which they reference each other. And it's obvious that although they respected each other, Bluntschli, as the younger man, knew that von Mohr is the great German public lawyer. Nevertheless, Bluntschli, in his reflections, in the 3 volumes of the reflections of his life, he says, well, yes, he was, of course, a very dignified man, but sometimes went overboard with his strange, eccentric ideas. And von Mohr had scruples about the direction of the political activism of this younger person. Now, Bluntschli also in 1856 engages with the idea of Gesellschaftswissenschaft, social science. And he says, this is in an article, über die neuen Begründungen der Gesellschaft und des Gesellschaftsrechts. He says this in my translation. All institutions of common public life, such as municipalities, fragmentary political and associations or churches, possess only a relative independence and are always subordinated to the state. So Bluntschli is known as a kind of liberal of sorts. Menschenrechte was part of his vocabulary, famously in his codification of international law. There's this long foreword in which he talks about Menschenrechte. Oh yes, so there will be Menschenrechte and the state, but there is no space in between. And the article tries to suggest that the individual and the state, with whom he associates with private law and public law, are utterly interdependent, and they relate to each other like the sea and the shoreline. So the public law often penetrates to the private realm, determining how private realm should operate, and the private realm often pushes the public realm to refrain from intervening, etc. But that there is nothing in between, nor should there be. And why would this be important? Well, it's important for me because for this new generation of men who create this new project, sitting down on the 8th of September in Ghent after lunch, and who pass the statutes of the Institut de Droit International, Bluntschli sits there. And it's actually Bluntschli who has drafted the language of the statute of the Institute, where the new profession of international law describes itself as the juridical conscience of the civilized world. And now I come to my punchline, which is this. So with Bluntschli, the vocabulary of civilization enters the international legal realm as the vocabulary that enables those men to talk about the world in general. So we are all related through this grand idea of civilization. And what is that grand idea of civilization? Well, I said earlier that the international lawyers never really were quite clear about what it was, apart from the fact that whatever it was, it made the Europeans the rulers of everyone else. So there were degrees of civilization, and Bluntschli and his colleagues in Ghent thought that we represent the highest level, and everyone else down there are in different relationships to this goal that we present to them. Right, and so this is my last slide. So here is where I will stop. So I suggest that there was a moment in the 19th century that a vocabulary might have emerged to produce the basis on which a new kind of an international law would be created. By mid-century, everyone thought that the Martens fashion of thinking about the international world was insufficient and even wrong. It didn't articulate the features of modernity that people like Hegel and others, then Stein, von Moll, saw around themselves. The great dynamism of individual association, of individual spontaneity, the internationalism of everything that was going on. And that they were thinking, well, this is society on the move. But the idea of society had these dangerous implications. It came from a revolutionary inheritance. It reflected the writings of the French socialists. It was very close to the revolutionary idea of fraternité, of solidarity and solidarism, which had its short life in the Third Republic at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. And those ideas were part of what the profession saw itself as being against. It was against the revolutionary inheritance and in favor of an understanding of modernity as a hierarchical, progressive development of history, so that at the end, everyone would be like these old guys here. And I stop there. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for this extremely interesting lecture, as to be expected, of course, Professor Koskenniemi. So now I think we have about 30 minutes for questions from the audience, also from people online. So I've muted you. Everyone online is muted, but if you raise your hand or type something, I will see that you want to say something, so will unmute you, obviously. So without further ado, are there any questions from the audience? I think there are many aspects that you can engage with. Yes, Professor Smith. So you will need a microphone in order to have the online people hear you.
Just a small question to start with. Is it a coincidence that most of the doctrine you refer to was German doctrine?
Yes. So it's not my intention to dwell the rest of my life among the German scholarship and the stuffy archives of Göttingen or so. It's just so, but I can't, go around the fact that the most interesting legal thinking comes from Germany. Let me say, came from Germany, at least in this time. I'm on record of having written an article with the title International Law as a German Discipline. And in some sense, I think that it's impossible to understand international law in its many permutations without having a clear idea of what was going on in the German legal field back home in the various universities in Germany, as well, not only in the law faculty but also in the philosophy faculty and so on. Please believe me that it's not my intention to, wave the German flag, but I just find myself over and over again in the awkward situation of reading dead Germans because of the depth and seriousness with which they engaged with social questions from through a legal education and through legal vocabulary. Now, I've tried to, in the uttermost parts, I've tried to give some reasons to that as well. So if you look at French faculties, the Faculté de Droit in France, there is nothing intellectually really interesting. And so in the 19th century, there's a few treatises on natural law, which are obviously very old-fashioned. And there are a few thinkers outside the faculties, as there always was in France. So if in the 18th century, it's a intellectual death sentence to be at the university in France. So you had individuals, but of course the socialist thinking so France does a lot of that, but it never translates itself into a powerful legal thing. Now in England, the Brits themselves are very clear, and I reference a mid-century review of teaching of law in general in Oxford and Cambridge. And the review is great fun to read because it is the English themselves who say that they, and I've quoted it in my book, there are some really fantastic statements that this so-called legal teaching in Cambridge and Oxford is worth of nothing. And the only teaching worthy of its name is in the Inns of Court, but that's teaching in the common law. So for boys to become common lawyers, and although common law has a certain idea of law of nations, that is still very far away from ours, and it contains no philosophical reflection. So people like John Austin and John Westlake, so the two names that often crop up from the British scene in the 19th century, were both trained in Germany or were doing the German thing. Austin, after his province of jurisprudence, before his province of jurisprudence determined, was there listening to Savigny, and Westlake's 1858, private international law, the first private international law produced in the English language, is really a German, a transposition of a German way of thinking. And he also had been in Germany earlier on. So I cannot imagine away these facts. And of course, there is in the 18th century German natural law treatises, there is a huge amount of repetition and rubbish, and I hope to no one the fate of losing themselves in the archives reading that stuff. But if you are there in the archives and you read that stuff, every now and then you notice that, well, there is an interesting conversation in which people are seriously trying to understand, especially in the early 19th century, as to what modernity is about. And then there are these high peaks of development, like Kant, obviously, but even more, I would say, Hegel.
Thank you. There is a lot of other questions.
Many thanks, Martti. That was such a fascinating panorama, and I would fully agree that these are really eminent legal and political thinkers. They are so interesting and attractive from their ideas. And I think you can name some good reasons why this is so, because there is the tradition of the Old Reich with its plurality of territories, sovereignty, semi-sovereignty. So they have all to think this through, even before 1806. And then there is the new plurality of the Deutsche Bund. And again, you know, this public law tradition challenges them to make something out of it, to explain this, to balance rights, interests, society, and powers. So that would be my explanation why this is a very fertile ground. I'd like to challenge your punchline. If I understood you correctly, you said Bluntschli's civilization has some kind of dangerous implications towards society, solidarism, because it has a revolutionary background. Before that, no, it's the other way around. Civilization is attractive because the Mohl idea, so to say, of internationale Gemeinschaft, which he elaborated in 1860, is somehow tainted with revolutionary thinking. I have another idea. Maybe this goes in combination. I'm not sure. I'm wondering if Mohl maybe went too far challenging national state sovereignty, because he came from this, you know, Polizeiwissenschaft background, and we can go further when we, you know, go beyond, and we have to make some kind of a network and so on. And when you read this and when you look how this is read in the 19th century, I mean, many people are very enthusiastic about this idea of Mohl, like the Russian, so to say, Martens. And they are really following this internationale Gemeinschaftsidee as a new paradigm, and solidarity is the big new paradigm. And it's always in a juxtaposition to sovereignty. And what makes it finally fail in the intellectual thinking is it is challenging too much national sovereignty. So for the German Empire, it does not fit because they are very much into, you know, power politics. But also I feel with the other empires, this goes too far. So I think it's not revolutionary left thinking, but it's, so to say, the right and national sovereignty tradition, which makes Mohl seem a bit dubious for the other eminent international lawyers. But maybe we can combine this. I'm not sure. This is just, you know, mentioning sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you, Milos. Yes, I think we perhaps are able to combine these views. Let me just agree with you first and what you said at the beginning, that I think that the reason for why international law is a German discipline, the reason for that is that there is this long tradition of thinking during the Old Reich about the relationship between the Landeshoheit of the individual estates and the sovereignty of the empire. And so all the lawyers had to be able to square the circle by saying how the Länder could do whatever they wanted, although sovereignty was with the empire and they had just Landeshoheit. And that is the international law question par excellence. So what international lawyers are called upon to do is to say how their states can be both sovereign and members of the UN, members of the European Community, etc. And we, of course, know how we can do that. We said, well, we joined the EU through a sovereign act, etc. So all of these linguistic techniques that have been developed are techniques that the German lawyers already before the Peace of Westphalia were able to develop in order to explain to their princes at home in Baden or wherever that yes, you are the ruler here, and the emperor, yes, the emperor is sovereign, but you are ruler. And so I say square the circle. So it is to do the impossible, which is so that's my first point. So I am interested, well, and Wouter's work is one indication of this. So the peace associations, so the peace societies, they are utterly invisible here. So they have no presence in these debates. One would think that von Moll would mention as one of the Soziale Kreise or one of the associations peace, but he doesn't. But it's also the labor movement. So it doesn't. So 1848, and Marx and Engels had just written, all the proletarians unite. So that's an international legal proposition, isn't it? And it's by 1860, it already starts to have power, that statement. And the first international is there very soon. And the labor unions start to organize themselves. So, but none of that is visible in words, although reading it ex post facto, one constantly thinks that, oh, that's what he must be thinking. But maybe it's you can't write that. So if you were to write that for Moll, etc., then he would seem even more eccentric than he otherwise would seem to be. But to move a little bit to the present. So, but I'm interested in this way in which the idea of an international society or an international community then comes up in the 20th century. And so it links to various kinds of more or less idealistic streams in international law. And I always had the sense that already when I hear that word, it has already failed. That there is something about that vocabulary that has been so utterly and fundamentally relegated to a secondary, to an how would I say, undangerous secondary position, that it's odd. And being somebody from the left and worried about the fate, let me put it to the present, worried about the fate of social democracy. Now, I'm not a social democrat, I've never had a party card, etc. But I think a lot of the problems in our present society with populism, with violence, with with inequality especially, has to do, this I think is uncontroversial, has to do with what happened to social democracy. So the Trente Glorieuses used to be the time, the welfare state, and the time when social democracy thrived. And now social democracy is in dire straits. And so my interest here, as always with historical work, is to understand the present. Why is it that the aspect of the social seems so uninteresting or unappealing now as a statement for political and legal action?
Grotius. And so my question is also about Vittoria and Grotius and their notion of international society, because at Grotius, of course, you have the appetitus socialis. At Vittoria, you have the jus societatis et communicationis. And so when Moore comes up with that notion that society is important, that society should be considered in international law, that doesn't strike me as a very new idea, because that is something that you have in the 16th and 17th century, and later on the English school of international relations in the 20th century also draws on that as a form of international society. So, and you mentioned that this is something that is challenging, that is maybe threatening the stability of that restoration period. I wonder how that shift came about, like from this kind of liberal economy-oriented and maybe even Catholic or Protestant in the case of the later thinkers. A connotation to something that is revolutionary with the French Revolution, and whether I think in your book, in the uttermost part of the world, you see this development from the 16th, 17th century to the state-centered notion of international law in Germany due to German history and the plurality of sovereignties. And so is this like almost like a return of a suppressed notion that is coming back? That would be one part of the question. Like, how does this relate to the earlier use of the term societatis in the international law context? And the second part is, I also published something recently with people from your institute, from Eric Castren Institute, Jean-P. Morrissey, a book about the patent law, the development of patent law and international property rights. And in that relation, in that situation, you see very clearly that private actors in the 19th century, like for example, the Siemens brothers, but also these civil society organizations, they are very active in formulating these trade rules and regulations in the international realm. And how does that go together with that idea that international law is state-centered and does not consider that? And the third and last question would be, since you are a diplomat and not only, or you were a diplomat and not only a historian, maybe it's fair to ask you what your normative idea would be, what the alternative vocabulary of international law should ideally be if another path of development would have been taken.
Okay, so the first question is really straightforward. So I was thinking about appetitus societatis myself, and Grotius and Vittoria and all that. This is a different thing. This is not, so the appetitus societatis is something that an individual has, and they are born with, and then that directs them to come together, etc. This now is a set of relationships. So this is not the individual. This is expressly to get away from the idea that there are individuals and state, that there is a set of relationships that on which society consists of. It doesn't cancel out the individual appetitus societatis. It may still be valid or not valid, however, but that's not what these men are talking about. They are talking about relationships of rule. So that's how I see it, and therefore I think it's part of modernity. It's part of, so, and the relationship is and these are relationships that I think Adam Smith has characterized most clearly. Okay, so that's my response to the first question. So in the 19th century, patent in the, so intellectual property lawyers, anachronistically called in the 19th century, and patent law. So that had a great boost, and people were writing articles on that. And I think there was in the first societies of private international law, patent and intellectual property lawyers, or patent or intellectual property concerns were very predominant. But that somehow, so because of the disciplinary limits, that also is relatively invisible to these public law persons. So von Stein, who is more widespread in his mind. So he references that. So in this 1882 article that I mentioned, intellectual property rights are there. It's part of the, he writes a lot about private relations and private legal relations as part of this new new international recht that he comes up with. But otherwise, I think he is pretty alone in that, and he never has. He becomes a member of the Institut de Droit International. He produces one report to the Institute in the 1880s on railways, on the international law of railways. But that's very technical, and it doesn't really go into that. Now the third one is my normative thing. So yeah, I get that a lot. So what is your normative thing? But so I have this view about language and vocabularies, that languages are both, as Paul de Man would say, mechanisms of insight, but also mechanisms of blindness. Through language, you get to see something, but language also makes you blind to the things that the language cannot articulate. So, and this incapacitates me for pushing forward the revolutionary language, because there is no such language that would not come with its dark sides and its blindnesses, etc. And I'm just a university person, a researcher. I am analyzing these languages, and my normative agenda is to make people aware that the wonderful languages of human rights and peace, etc., that they have very severe dark sides to them. And my utopia is a place where everybody is aware of the dark sides of the language. So that's the only normative project, right?
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting and thought-provoking talk. I have two questions actually. The first one is rather about the concepts you use when citing Stein's article of 82 in Smoller's Jahrbuch. You mentioned that he claims for something like an internationalization of governance, if I got it right. And so I was wondering, and if you happen to remember what the German term he used was, because governance is sort of strikes me as, yeah.
Can I just immediately?
Sure, of course.
So he uses the term Verwaltung.
Verwaltung.
Yes, and I think my friend Benedict Kingsbury and others in the global administrative law field I found von Stein in their footnotes as an early representative of international administration. But I want to translate international Verwaltung as governance, because I don't think Stein had such a clear idea that the Verwaltung he was thinking of internationally had exactly the same aspects to it as German Verwaltung.
Okay. Very interesting indeed. And my second question is a bit of like a follow-up of Milos's question. I was not entirely sure to really grasp in conceptual terms your final argument, and I was wondering if you could expand on that. So if I got you right, the argument is something like the term of civilization came up towards the last third of the 19th century, and it could have been society, right? And then the argument, if I still got it right, is that the term of civilization had the advantage of sort of evacuating the dangerous legacy of the French Revolution. Well, I was wondering, and perhaps you could expand on that, because in the French revolutionary tradition, at least in the more moderate strands of it, you could think of Condorcet, for instance, there is quite a heavy sort of reliance on these terms, and not necessarily, by the way, in colonial terms. Condorcet himself was an early adherent to the Société des Amis des Noirs, for instance. So I was wondering if you could clarify this a little bit to me.
Well, Thomas, thanks. That's an excellent point. And I'm just so happy that I realized that I have thought about that. And that I, nevertheless, having thought about that, I still wanted to push this idea forward, because and this would, of course, require more work and more writing. But my sense is that the civilization that emerges from Bluntschli is not the civilization of Condorcet or those. And I need to argue, well, how come? Well, I don't think Bluntschli was really a fan of the revolutionary inheritance. Instead, he was trained in the German historical school, the historical school Savigny, etc. Have a certain idea of what law stands for. So how law emerges, it's in the Volksgeist or in the Geist of something, and the Geist is then being expressed by the class of lawyers, educated lawyers. And of course, when you talk about the international, then you can't talk about Volksgeist, really. You have to be another kind of a Geist, something that is shared by everyone. And then that I think is Bluntschli's idea of civilization. He can still pursue the historical school. He's also critical of the historical school, but that's his basic background. So he can pursue the historical school of idea that law is something deeply embedded in the people who apply it. It's not just legislation, and that the lawyers do it. And so he thinks, well, how do I put together what belongs to the Africans, the Europeans, the Siamese, the Japanese, etc. And he thinks, well, with civilization, I can, put these all together while at the same time making distinctions that I see that are real to him and to us. And then there is the colonial project underway. Now, as I've written in The Gentle Civilizer, the Institute itself embarked on a project to try to define the standard of civilization. Many people have written on it, Gerrit Gong first, but many others then, Tony Angie. But also, so what I did was that I actually read the Institute reports on the successive meetings where they discussed the standard of civilization. And at the end, Sir Travers Twiss, who was then the rapporteur, he had to report to the Institute that this is incomplete, that we cannot do this because there are so many different aspects to this. And I drew the conclusion. My own conclusion is that it was never intended to be a clear-cut thing. So because it can be instrumentalized in order to support the Western colonial powers better, as long as it's flexible and you can use it in different ways. I don't deny the fact that it was really impossible for the Institute members to come up with an anthropological set of classifications of civilization. Of course it was hard, or of course it was impossible. But there was also the political need to leave it open so that you can use it in order to justify the demands of rulership that needed to be justified at the time.
So, yeah. Should I read it? So, in what ways the vocabulary of civilization in international law design the rule for what can be counted as global or international? So that was the first question.
So civilization, as I indicated a moment ago, to repeat briefly, civilization enables taking into account the visible differences between cultures and giving those visible differences a normative sense, namely that some cultures are more developed than other cultures. The vocabulary of civilization itself has become non grata more recently, and therefore we use the vocabulary of development. So we have developed countries, developing countries, etc. That does pretty much the same as the vocabulary of civilization does, or modernity, or modernization. So I would say that kind of a vocabulary is essential for a global rule, because the globe consists of differences. How do you take those differences into account while at the same time encompassing all of them? Civilization allows that, development allows that, modernity allows that.
And the last question was, can you say a little bit more about what the role of political practice was in those discourses about the new vocabulary?
Well, it seems obvious to me that the vocabulary of the social in the 19th century was a vocabulary of struggle. So Lawrence von Stein was clear that if that's the way you go, then you start by identifying different interests that people have and the conflicts that emerge from those interests. If you go down that way, you may even end up with classes, social classes, and class conflict. And that already points to very easily definable political practices. The vocabulary of civilization merely points to the political practice of ruling the uncivilized, that is to say, colonization. And of course, these are very general vocabularies, and people can use them and did use them for various different kinds of purposes. So not everyone in the new international law profession towards the end of the 19th century was an enthusiast of colonization, or the enthusiasts of colonization had many different groups among themselves. They understood the civilizational differences in different ways. But there was a very strong center that had a very hierarchical or associated civilization with very hierarchical ideas about human communities. So James Lorimer from Edinburgh being the famously or notoriously the most adamant on that there are the civilized countries, the barbarian countries, and the savages. And well, many people thought in those terms, three levels. But one has to bear in mind that more everyday understandings, such as Adam Smith's famous historical study or historical view of stages of history. So that already, if you think in terms of stages of history, then you have already a hierarchical arrangement where somebody is at an earlier stage and somebody is at a later stage. And that's what development does. So in the 50s and 60s, when it became impolitic to speak of civilization, you started to say, well, underdeveloped. And then underdeveloped turned into developing, and so on. So we are constantly struggling with how to find the vocabulary that will articulate the differences that we see out there and that we think are important for our political practices in such a way that, that it can be used as a winning language in practice.
So thank you very much. We would like to continue for hours, but unfortunately we can't. We have to stop here. So again, many thanks, Martti, for this keynote and for being here, and also to the audience for the questions. And we will then move for our symposium in another room. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you.
So thank you also to the people watching online. So this is where we cut our meeting short. So I wish everyone, both in the room and online, of course, a sunny Friday afternoon, if it's sunny, of course, where you live. But anyway, thank you for watching, and see you later, hopefully. Goodbye.